My name is River, and for as long as I can remember, I've felt a deep connection to nature. It wasn't just an interest or a hobby, it was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt completely at peace. The hum of the wind through the trees, the rush of water over smooth river stones, the call of birds in the distance, it was as though the natural world spoke to me in a language that I alone could understand. It wasn't just that I loved it, it was that I needed it. From my earliest days, I knew that the earth, and all its beauty and fragility, was something sacred. It was where I felt most alive, and as I grew, it became the focus of my life. Everything I did, every choice I made, was somehow tied to my love for this planet. Growing up, I spent most of my time outdoors. My childhood was marked by long, wandering days in the forests near my home, tracing the paths of rivers and streams, climbing trees, and marveling at the intricate balance of ecosystems that seemed so perfect in their design. I would crouch low to the ground, watching ants march in single file, or sit by the water's edge, mesmerized by the way sunlight danced on the rippling surface. My parents encouraged my curiosity, and by the time I was 10, I could name nearly every plant and animal native to our region. But it wasn't just about knowing their names, it was about understanding them, respecting them. I learned early on that the natural world was delicate, its balance easily disrupted by careless hands. That knowledge shaped me. I knew, even as a child, that protecting the earth would always be my priority. When I was a teenager, I began to see the cracks in that balance. Deforestation had claimed parts of the forest I had once played in. Rivers I loved were polluted, their waters murky and lifeless. I couldn't understand it. How could anyone see the beauty of this planet and destroy it so thoughtlessly? That question planted a seed in me, a seed of responsibility. I couldn't just stand by and watch it happen. I needed to do something. That determination stayed with me as I grew older, and by the time I reached adulthood, it had become my purpose. I embarked on a journey to become an environmental activist, dedicating my life to protecting the planet. It was a calling I couldn't ignore, a weight I willingly carried because I felt I had no other choice. If I didn't fight for the earth, who would? As an activist, I threw myself into the work with everything I had. I spoke at rallies. I organized protests. I wrote articles and petitions, urging people to take action before it was too late. My passion was fueled by the knowledge that the destruction of nature was the most devastating tragedy of our time. Every tree cut down, every species lost, every polluted river felt like a personal wound. I couldn't bear to see the Earth's ecosystems, so intricate, so perfect, being torn apart. And so, I fought. I fought with every ounce of strength I had because I believed, with all my heart, that it was a fight worth fighting. But the fight wasn't easy. The more I saw, the harder it became to hold on to hope. I felt anger, burning, seething anger, at the greed and carelessness that drove so much of the destruction. I felt frustration at the apathy of people who didn't seem to care, who couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. And more than anything, I felt sorrow, a deep, aching sorrow for what was being lost. There were times when it felt like the weight of it all was too much to bear. I started to wonder if it was all pointless. Was I making a difference, or was I just screaming into the void? Even as I poured myself into activism, attending protests, leading campaigns, speaking out at every opportunity, I felt the edges of my hope begin to fray. I was losing faith, not in the earth, but in humanity's ability to save it. No matter how hard I fought, it seemed like the forces of destruction were always one step ahead. I began to feel as though I was shouting into a storm, my voice lost in the chaos. And yet, I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. Even as despair crept in, I kept pushing forward because I didn't know how to do anything else. But recently, something inside me began to shift. A question started to take root in my mind, one I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. Was it enough? Was anything I was doing enough to actually make a difference? The thought terrified me. I had dedicated my entire life to this cause, to this fight. If it wasn't enough, then what was the point? The fear of failure, of irrelevance, gnawed at me, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it only grew stronger. That fear began to consume me. I started to feel as though my efforts were becoming more desperate, more frantic, as though I was trying to outrun a tidal wave that would inevitably overtake me. My soul felt weary, weighed down by the enormity of the task I had taken on. And somewhere deep inside, I began to feel the stirrings of something I had never felt before, the sense that my own end was near. It was as though my body, my spirit, was telling me that I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. Then came the protest that changed everything. It was meant to be like so many others I had attended, a show of solidarity, a way to make our voices heard. But this one was different. The tension in the air was palpable from the start, and as the day wore on, it became clear that things were spiraling out of control. The police were aggressive, their presence oppressive. The crowd was restless, their anger bubbling just beneath the surface. And then, chaos erupted. I remember the sound of shouting, the press of bodies, the sting of tear gas in the air. And then, I remember being hit. A projectile struck me with such force that I felt the world tilt and spin. My senses began to fade, and as I crumpled to the ground, everything went black. What happened next is something I will never forget. I felt myself leaving my body, as though I was being lifted out of it by some unseen force. There was no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of lightness and peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on me. I didn't want to go back. I could see my body lying still on the ground, surrounded by chaos, but it felt distant, like I was an observer in a play I no longer had a role in. I was no longer bound by the physical laws of the world, and something warm and loving and irresistible was calling me forward. I knew I had to follow it. As I moved toward the source of that calling, I saw a light. But it wasn't like any light I had ever seen before. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, enveloping, and filled with a love so profound that it brought tears to my eyes. It felt like home, like I had always belonged there but had only just found my way back. The closer I got, the more my pain and fear melted away. I traveled through what felt like a tunnel, the light growing brighter and warmer with every step. And then, at the end of the tunnel, I saw him. Jesus. He wasn't what I had expected. There were no flowing robes or golden halos, just a presence so radiant, so full of love, that it took my breath away. He didn't speak with words, but I understood him perfectly. He knew me. He knew the depths of my soul, my fears, my anger, my sorrow. And yet, he loved me. Completely, unconditionally. It was a love unlike anything I had ever experienced, and in that moment, I felt whole in a way I never had before. Jesus communicated to me that my fight for the earth was noble, but that I had been missing something essential. He was the source of all creation, the true healer, and it was only through his love and grace that the brokenness of the world, and of humanity, could truly be mended. He showed me his life, his teachings, his miracles, and his ultimate sacrifice. And I understood, in a way I never had before, that everything he had done was out of love. Pure, selfless love. He told me I no longer had to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. I bore all the pain and suffering, he said. You no longer have to carry this burden. Embrace my love, and let it heal your soul. He revealed to me that true harmony wasn't something we could achieve on our own. It wasn't just about protecting the planet, it was about being in communion with him, the source of all life. He showed me heaven, a place of perfect balance, love, and healing. And he showed me hell, the result of separation from his love and grace. Your fight for the earth is important, he said, but it must come from a place of love, not anger. My path is one of compassion, understanding, and love. That is the only way to heal this world. I understood then that my near-death experience was a gift, a way for me to see the truth I had been missing. Jesus asked me to surrender my fears, to trust in him, and to let his love guide me. He told me my new mission was not just to protect the planet, but to show people his love and grace. Your strength will come from faith, he said, not from fear or anger. Through me, you will find the power to heal not just the earth, but the hearts of those who live on it. As the light began to fade, I felt a sense of peace unlike anything I had ever known. I understood that my time in that place, his place, was over, but I wasn't afraid. I was ready to return, ready to carry the message of his love and grace back to the world. When I woke up in the hospital, I knew my life had changed forever. I had been saved, not by chance, but for a reason. My near-death experience had given me a new direction, a new purpose. I began sharing my story, telling anyone who would listen about the love of Jesus and the vision he had shown me. It wasn't always easy. Some people didn't understand, and others accused me of abandoning my old beliefs. But I knew the truth. My fight for the planet hadn't ended, it had transformed. It was no longer about anger or despair. It was about love, the kind of love that can heal even the deepest wounds. Through him, I found the strength to continue, not as the person I had been, but as someone renewed. My mission is now one of love, healing, and grace. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that through him, true healing and salvation are within reach for all of us. Through him, I found clarity, an understanding that the world's brokenness wasn't something I alone could fix, but something he had already begun healing through his sacrifice and love. My role was no longer to fight against the tide with anger or frustration, but to bring his message of hope and redemption to a world desperate for it. I realized that the activism I had once embraced, rooted in my own strength and determination, had been transformed into something far greater. It was now an act of faith, a testament to his power working through me. When I left the hospital, I carried a profound sense of peace, but also a renewed determination. The first steps were difficult. I had to rebuild not only my physical strength, but also prepare myself for the challenges ahead. I knew that the path Jesus had shown me wouldn't be easy. The world has always been resistant to messages of love and grace, and I was stepping into a new chapter of my life that required courage, patience, and unwavering trust in him. I began speaking publicly about my experience, not just to environmentalists or activists, but to anyone who would listen. Churches, community centers, schools, and even small-town gatherings became the spaces where I shared my story. I spoke about the beauty of creation, its fragility, and the ways we've been called to protect it, not as isolated beings, but as stewards of God's creation. I explained how Jesus had shown me that while our planet matters deeply, it is ultimately through his love that the earth and humanity can be healed. At first, not everyone understood. Some who had marched beside me in protests felt betrayed, accusing me of abandoning the cause. They said I had diluted the message, that I had traded passion for passivity. But that wasn't true. My passion for the earth was still alive, it had only deepened, rooted now in something eternal rather than fleeting. I wasn't just fighting for the planet anymore, I was fighting for people's souls, for their understanding of the Creator who loves them beyond measure. That realization gave me strength to endure the criticism and misunderstandings. Gradually, as I continued to share my journey, something beautiful began to happen. People started to listen, to truly listen. At first, it was just a handful, a young man who approached me after a talk, tears in his eyes as he shared how my story had rekindled his faith. A woman who had felt abandoned by God but found hope in my words. A teenager who had been on the brink of despair but was inspired to look at the world differently. These encounters reminded me of what Jesus had shown me during my near-death experience, that every heart touched by his love is a victory, no matter how small it may seem. I also began to notice changes in myself. The anger that had once driven me, an anger born of heartbreak and helplessness, was replaced by compassion. Where I had once seen enemies in those who exploited the earth, I now saw broken people in need of redemption. Jesus had taught me that judgment and condemnation wouldn't heal the world, but love and forgiveness could. I started to approach my activism differently, focusing not just on the what of environmental justice, but on the why, the deeper, spiritual reasons we're called to care for creation and each other. One of the most profound moments came during a public forum where I was invited to debate an industrial leader whose company had been responsible for significant environmental damage. In the past, I would have confronted him with anger, listing every failure and demanding change. But this time, I spoke with a different tone. I shared my story, not as an attack, but as an invitation. I told him about the love and grace I had experienced through Jesus and how it had transformed my perspective on what it meant to fight for justice. Instead of vilifying him, I asked him to join me in seeking solutions that honored both the earth and the people who depend on it. To my surprise, he listened. And though he didn't immediately change his ways, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps conviction. I knew that the seeds had been planted. As time went on, I began to feel the weight of my new mission in both small and profound ways. People started reaching out to me, not just to talk about environmental issues, but to ask deeper questions about life, faith, and purpose. I found myself sitting with strangers in coffee shops, on park benches, and in church pews, listening to their stories and sharing the truth I had come to know, that Jesus is the source of all healing, for the earth and for our hearts. One day, I was approached by a young woman named Grace, who had been deeply involved in environmental activism but was on the verge of giving up. She told me how exhausted she felt, how the weight of the world seemed too heavy to carry. Her words echoed the despair I had once felt, and I knew exactly what to say to her. I shared my story, not just the details of my near-death experience, but the transformation that had followed. I told her about the peace I had found in surrendering to Jesus, about how his love had lifted the burden I could no longer bear on my own. By the end of our conversation, she was in tears. "I want that peace," she said. "I want to know that kind of love." We prayed together, and in that moment, I saw the beginning of her own transformation. These encounters became the heart of my new life. Each person I spoke to, each story I heard, reminded me of the interconnectedness Jesus had shown me during my vision. We are all part of something greater, all bound together by his love. And just as I had been called to share that love, I realized that everyone I touched was also being called in their own unique way. The ripple effect was real, and it was beautiful. My work as an activist didn't end, it evolved. I continued to advocate for environmental stewardship, but now I did so with a message that went beyond policy and science. I spoke about the spiritual dimensions of our relationship with the earth, about the Creator who had entrusted us with its care. I worked alongside churches and faith-based organizations, helping them integrate environmental responsibility into their missions. And I watched as people began to see the fight for the planet not as a burden, but as an act of worship, a way to honor the God who made it. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the years of struggle, the moments of despair, and the extraordinary encounter that had changed everything. I thought about Jesus, his presence, his words, his love, and how it had all been a gift, one I could never fully repay. But I also knew that he didn't ask for repayment. He simply asked for trust, for faith, and for a willingness to follow him. And that was exactly what I intended to do for the rest of my life. As I sat under the stars one night, the same stars that had always filled me with wonder, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The earth was still fragile, still in need of care, but I no longer carried the weight of saving it alone. I had found a source of strength far greater than myself, a love so vast and so perfect that it could heal not just the planet, but the hearts of all who lived on it. And as I gazed up at the heavens, I whispered a prayer of thanks, not just for the earth I loved, but for the Savior who had shown me its true beauty. Under the vast night sky, I felt a sense of peace I had never known before my encounter with Jesus. The stars, which had once seemed like distant, unreachable points of light, now felt alive with purpose, as if they, too, were part of his grand design. Though my journey had taken me through valleys of despair and moments of doubt, I now stood firmly in the knowledge that I was walking in step with him. Every breath I took, every action I made, was no longer driven by the frantic urgency I had once felt, but by the quiet assurance that I was part of something eternal. Life didn't suddenly become easy, far from it. There were still days when the enormity of the world's problems threatened to overwhelm me. I still saw forests being cut down, rivers polluted, and wildlife displaced. But now, instead of being consumed by despair, I turned to prayer. I asked for strength, for guidance, and for the wisdom to make a difference in the ways I could. And each time, without fail, I felt his presence, reminding me that I was not alone. This wasn't my battle to fight alone, it was his, and I was merely his servant, carrying out the work he had entrusted to me. One of the most transformative experiences during this time came when I was invited to speak at a global environmental summit. It was the kind of high-profile event I had once dreamed of attending, a place where world leaders, scientists, and activists gathered to discuss the most pressing issues facing the planet. But this time, my approach was different. I wasn't there to lecture or to condemn, I was there to share the truth that had changed my life. I opened my speech not with statistics or dire warnings, but with my story, how I had been brought to the brink of death and shown the overwhelming love and grace of Jesus. I spoke about how that experience had transformed my understanding of what it truly means to care for the earth. My friends, I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion, we can pour our hearts and souls into protecting this planet, and we should. But without love, without the kind of love that comes from the Creator of all things, our efforts will always fall short. True healing, for the earth and for ourselves, can only come through Him. There was a hush over the room as I spoke, and for the first time, I saw not skepticism or resistance in the faces of those listening, but a glimmer of hope. Later, several people approached me, some with tears in their eyes, thanking me for sharing a perspective they had never considered before. It was a moment that reaffirmed everything I had come to believe, that the world was hungry for the love and truth of Jesus, even if it didn't yet realize it. As my mission evolved, so did the way I spent my days. I continued to work with environmental organizations, but I also began to spend more time in ministry. I led Bible studies focused on the biblical call to stewardship, showing others how caring for creation was deeply rooted in Scripture. I partnered with churches to host events that combined environmental cleanups with worship and prayer, demonstrating how faith and action could go hand in hand. And I mentored young people who were passionate about the planet, helping them see how their love for nature could be a reflection of their love for its Creator. One of the most rewarding parts of this new chapter was watching others discover what I had come to know. I'll never forget the day I met a young man named Ethan. He was a college student studying environmental science, full of passion but weighed down by the same despair I had once felt. He came to one of my talks, and afterward, he approached me hesitantly. "I've been struggling," he admitted. "I want to make a difference, but it feels like nothing I do will ever be enough. How do you keep going?" I looked at him and saw a reflection of my younger self, earnest, driven, but burdened by the weight of the world. I told him my story, how I had once felt the same way, and how Jesus had lifted that burden from me. "Ethan," I said, "you don't have to carry this alone. None of us can save the world on our own. But with Him, all things are possible. He's the one who created this planet, and He's the one who will ultimately restore it. Your role is important, but it's not about doing it all yourself. It's about trusting Him to work through you." We prayed together that day, and I could see the tension in his face begin to ease. Over time, Ethan became one of my closest allies, a young man whose faith and passion inspired everyone around him. Watching him grow in his relationship with Jesus and find new purpose in his work reminded me why I had been called to this path. As the years passed, my life became a blend of activism and ministry, each feeding into the other in ways I never could have imagined. I traveled to places I had only ever dreamed of, from the rainforests of South America to the deserts of Africa, sharing my message and working alongside people of all backgrounds to care for the earth. But no matter where I went, the heart of my mission remained the same, to point people toward the Creator, the source of all love, hope, and healing. And yet, for all the places I traveled and all the people I met, some of the most profound moments happened in the quiet of my own home. Daniel and I, who had walked this journey together for so many years, found new ways to serve together. We hosted small gatherings in our living room, inviting friends and neighbors to share meals and talk about faith, life, and the beauty of creation. Those evenings, filled with laughter, prayer, and heartfelt conversations, became some of my most cherished memories. They reminded me that while big events and grand speeches had their place, true transformation often happened in the simplest of settings, one heart at a time. There were still challenges, of course. Not everyone welcomed my message. Some dismissed me as naive or overly religious, while others accused me of abandoning the fight for the planet in favor of preaching. But I had learned to let go of the need for approval. My validation came not from the opinions of others, but from the knowledge that I was walking in obedience to the one who had called me. And in those moments of doubt, when the criticism threatened to sting, I turned to him in prayer, and he reminded me of his love, his grace, and his promises. As I write this now, I am struck by how far I have come, not just in the miles I've traveled, but in the transformation of my heart. The passion that once burned within me, fierce and unrelenting, has been refined into something deeper, steadier. It is no longer fueled by anger or despair, but by hope and love. I know now that the work I do is not mine alone, it is His, and I am simply His vessel. The stars outside my window are as bright as ever, and their light fills me with the same wonder I felt as a child. But now, that wonder is accompanied by a profound sense of peace. I don't have all the answers, and I don't need to. I know the one who does, and I trust Him completely. My journey is far from over, but I walk forward with confidence, knowing that every step I take is guided by His hand. And for that, I am endlessly grateful. As the years continued to unfold, my journey became a testament to the power of transformation, not only in my own life, but in the lives of those I encountered. The mission that Jesus had placed on my heart, a mission of healing and love, became my compass. Whether I was speaking to a crowd of thousands or sitting with a single person in a quiet moment of connection, I felt His presence guiding me. Each day, I woke with a sense of purpose, knowing that the work I was doing was not mine alone. It was His work, carried out through my hands, my words, and my faith. One of the most meaningful experiences during this time came when I was invited to speak at a retreat for young environmental activists. These were people just beginning their journeys, filled with passion and determination, but also burdened by the same questions I had once wrestled with. Was it enough? Could they make a difference? Would their efforts matter in the face of so much destruction? As I stood before them, looking into their hopeful but weary faces, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to encourage them, but to share the truth that had set me free. I told them my story, beginning with my childhood love of nature and the years I had spent fighting for the planet with every ounce of strength I had. I described the despair that had crept in, the moments when I had felt like giving up, and the near-death experience that had changed everything. I spoke about Jesus, about how His love had lifted the burden I could no longer carry and given me a new understanding of what it meant to care for creation. You are not alone in this fight, I told them. You were never meant to be. The Creator who made this world loves it, and you, more than you can possibly imagine. Trust Him. Let His love guide you, and you will find the strength to keep going. Afterward, many of them approached me, some with tears streaming down their faces. One young woman, her voice trembling with emotion, said, "I've been so afraid. Afraid that I'll fail, that it's all too big. But hearing you talk about Jesus, it gives me hope. Maybe I don't have to do this alone." We prayed together, and I could see the beginnings of a transformation in her eyes. It was a reminder of why I had been called to this path, to plant seeds of hope, to point others toward the one who could sustain them in ways I never could. But it wasn't just young activists who were impacted by the message I carried. Over time, I began to see a shift in the way people approached environmental issues. Churches that had once been hesitant to engage with topics like climate change and conservation started to see these efforts as extensions of their faith. Leaders from various denominations invited me to speak about the connection between stewardship and spirituality, and I watched as congregations came alive with a renewed sense of purpose. They organized cleanup drives, planted community gardens, and advocated for sustainable practices, not out of fear or obligation, but out of a deep love for the Creator and His creation. One particularly memorable moment came when I was invited to a rural church in the Midwest. It was a small congregation, humble but deeply rooted in their faith. I shared my story, speaking about the vision of heaven and earth that Jesus had shown me, and how His love extended to every corner of creation. After the service, an elderly farmer approached me, his weathered face lined with years of hard work. "I've always felt close to God out in the fields," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I never thought about how taking care of the land could be a way to honor him. Thank you for helping me see that. His words stayed with me, a reminder that even the simplest acts of care for the earth could be acts of worship. As my mission grew, so did the challenges. There were still those who dismissed me, who saw my faith as a weakness or my message as impractical. Some accused me of abandoning science, failing to understand that my belief in Jesus didn't negate my understanding of the natural world, it deepened it. I saw his fingerprints in every leaf, every drop of water, every star in the sky. Science and faith weren't at odds, they were two parts of the same truth, each revealing the majesty of the Creator in its own way. I continued to speak about this, even when it was difficult, knowing that the seeds I planted might take years to bear fruit, or might never bear fruit at all. But that wasn't for me to decide. My role was to be faithful, to trust that He would bring the harvest in His time. In the midst of this work, I also found joy in the simple moments of life. Daniel and I, now more deeply connected than ever, spent our days finding ways to serve together. Whether it was hosting small group discussions in our home, volunteering at local events, or simply walking hand in hand through the woods, we found that our love for each other had been strengthened by our shared faith. We often talked about the journey we had been on, marveling at how far we had come and how much we had changed. "Do you ever miss the old days?" he asked me once, as we sat by a crackling fire under the stars. I thought about it for a moment and then shook my head. "I don't miss the weight of it," I said. "I don't miss feeling like it was all up to me. Now, I feel free. Free to love, to serve, to trust. And that's more than I ever could have hoped for." That freedom became the foundation of everything I did. It allowed me to approach each day with gratitude, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. It gave me the courage to speak the truth, even when it was met with resistance. And it filled me with joy, even in the face of setbacks, because I knew that my work was not in vain. I was part of something far greater than myself, something eternal, and that knowledge sustained me through every trial. As I reflect on this journey, I am struck by the beauty of His plan. What began as a love for the earth became a calling to protect it, and what seemed like the end of that calling turned out to be the beginning of something far more profound. I have seen lives changed, hearts healed, and hope restored, not through my efforts, but through His grace. And I know that the work is far from over. There is still so much to do, so many people to reach, so many seeds to plant. But I step forward with confidence, knowing that I am not walking this path alone. The stars outside my window tonight are as bright as ever, a reminder of the Creator who placed them there. Their light, steady and unchanging, mirrors the love that has guided me through every twist and turn of this journey. I don't know what the future holds, but I know the one who holds it, and that is enough. My life is His, my work is His, and my heart is full of gratitude for the privilege of serving Him. And as I close my eyes, I whisper a prayer of thanks, not just for the journey I have walked, but for the journey still to come. The journey continued, as life always does, with new challenges and opportunities unfolding before me like pages in an unwritten book. Each day brought with it a renewed sense of purpose, a deep awareness that the work I was doing wasn't limited to the here and now, but was tied to something infinitely larger than myself. The world, with all its beauty and brokenness, still called to me, but now I answered that call not with the weight of despair, but with the light of hope. My mission was no longer just about saving the earth, it was about pointing others toward the one who had created it, the one who had saved me. One of the most transformative seasons of my life began when I was invited to join a global coalition of faith-based environmental organizations. This coalition was unique, bringing together people from diverse religious backgrounds who shared a common goal: to care for creation as an act of faith. Though our beliefs about God and the world sometimes differed, we were united by a shared conviction that the earth was a sacred trust, a gift that we had been called to steward with wisdom and love. Working alongside people from so many different walks of life was humbling and inspiring. It reminded me that God's love transcends boundaries, reaching into every culture, every community, every heart. Our work took us to some of the most vulnerable places on earth: coastal villages threatened by rising seas, arid regions struggling with desertification, forests on the brink of destruction. In each of these places, I saw firsthand the devastating impact of environmental degradation, but I also saw something else: resilience. The people we met, though often living in the shadow of immense challenges, showed a remarkable capacity for hope. They welcomed us with open arms, shared their stories, and worked alongside us to find solutions that honored both their needs and the needs of the earth. One moment that stands out in my memory took place in a small village in Southeast Asia. The region had been devastated by deforestation, leaving the land barren and the community struggling to survive. Our coalition partnered with local leaders to replant trees, restore soil health, and introduce sustainable farming practices. As we worked, I spent time with the villagers, listening to their stories and sharing my own. One evening, as we sat around a fire, an elderly woman named Amara spoke about her love for the forest that had once surrounded her home. "The trees were like family to us," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "When they were taken, it felt like we lost a part of ourselves." I felt a pang of recognition at her words, remembering my own grief at seeing the destruction of the places I had loved as a child. But as I listened to her, I also felt a stirring of hope. I told her about my journey, about the love and grace I had found in Jesus, and how it had transformed the way I saw the world. "The trees can grow again," I said, "and so can hope. We are not alone in this work. The Creator who made the forest loves it, and He loves you. He has not forgotten this place." Amara's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take my hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have given me something to hold on to." In the weeks that followed, I watched as the village began to come alive again. The first saplings were planted, and though it would take years for the forest to return, the seeds of hope had already taken root in the hearts of the people. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of faith and love could have ripple effects far beyond what we could see. Back home, my work with the coalition inspired me to deepen my own ministry. I began hosting workshops and retreats focused on the intersection of faith and environmental stewardship, inviting people to explore how their spiritual beliefs could inform and empower their care for creation. These gatherings became spaces of transformation, where people could wrestle with their doubts, renew their faith, and find practical ways to live out their convictions. I watched as individuals who had once felt powerless began to discover their own strength, not in themselves, but in the God who was working through them. One of the most powerful moments came during a retreat held at a nature preserve. The group included people from all walks of life: students, pastors, scientists, farmers, each bringing their unique perspectives and experiences. On the final evening, we held a time of reflection under the open sky. As the stars emerged, one by one, I invited everyone to share what they had learned or felt during our time together. A young man named Jacob, who had been quiet throughout the retreat, stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "I came here feeling lost," he said. "I've been struggling with my faith, with whether God even cares about this world and everything that's happening to it. But being here, hearing your story and seeing how much love and care is still out there, it's changed something in me. I feel like I'm starting to understand that God hasn't given up on us, and maybe I shouldn't either." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement, and in that moment, I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit so strongly that it brought tears to my eyes. It was a reminder that the work we were doing wasn't just about the earth, it was about hearts and souls, about drawing people closer to the Creator who loved them beyond measure. As the retreat ended and people began to return to their daily lives, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The seeds we had planted that weekend, both literal and spiritual, might take time to grow, but I trusted that God would nurture them in His own way and time. My role was simply to be faithful to the calling He had placed on my heart, to keep walking forward even when the path was unclear. In the quieter moments of life, I often found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the protests, the anger, the despair that had once consumed me, and how far I had come since then. I thought about the near-death experience that had changed everything, the moment when I had felt the love of Jesus so powerfully that it had reshaped my entire understanding of who I was and what I was called to do. And I thought about the people whose lives had intersected with mine along the way, people like Ethan, Amara, and Jacob, whose stories were now intertwined with my own. Each memory was a reminder of God's faithfulness, of His ability to bring beauty out of brokenness and light out of darkness. My life was far from perfect, and the world was still filled with challenges, but I no longer carried the weight of it alone. I had found freedom in surrender, joy in trust, and purpose in His love. As I look to the future, I don't know exactly where this journey will lead. There are still so many places to go, so many people to reach, so much work to be done. But I know that I don't have to have all the answers. I am walking in step with the one who holds the stars in His hands, the one who loves this world and everyone in it more than I can possibly comprehend. And that is enough. The night sky stretches endlessly above me, a canvas of light and mystery. As I gaze at the stars, I feel the same awe I felt as a child, the same sense of wonder that first drew me to the beauty of the earth. But now, that wonder is infused with something even deeper, a knowledge of the Creator who made it all, who made me, and who has called me to be a part of His work in this world. And as I whisper a quiet prayer of thanks, I feel His presence, steady and unchanging, guiding me forward into whatever comes next. The years continue to pass, each one bringing new lessons, challenges, and blessings. My life became an intricate tapestry woven with threads of faith, action, and connection. The work I was doing, both as an advocate for creation and as a messenger of God's love, felt more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined. Yet, I also came to understand that the work was never truly mine. It was His, always His, and I was simply the hands and feet carrying it out. As my message spread, more doors opened. I was invited to speak on larger platforms, addressing audiences that ranged from policymakers to church congregations, from environmental scientists to young children eager to learn about the world around them. Each audience brought its own challenges, but I trusted that God would give me the words they needed to hear. Sometimes, I would speak about the science of conservation, weaving in stories of hope and perseverance. Other times, I would share my testimony, opening my heart to strangers in the hope that they, too, might encounter the love and grace of Jesus. One of the most memorable opportunities came when I was invited to give a TED Talk. The event was focused on the intersection of science, faith, and social change, and I knew it would be a chance to reach people who might never set foot in a church or pick up a Bible. The thought was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. I prayed fervently in the weeks leading up to the event, asking God to guide my words and use them for His glory. When the day arrived, I stepped onto the stage under the bright lights, the audience a sea of expectant faces. I began by sharing my story, the love I had felt for the earth since childhood, the despair that had nearly consumed me, and the near-death experience that had transformed my life. I spoke about the vision Jesus had shown me, of a world healed not just through human effort, but through His love and grace. We cannot separate the physical from the spiritual, I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. Caring for creation isn't just about science or policy, it's about love. Love for each other, love for the earth, and love for the Creator who made it all. As I spoke, I could see the expressions in the audience shift. Some people nodded in agreement, others sat with their heads tilted in thought, and a few brushed away tears. When I finished, the applause was overwhelming, but what mattered most to me were the conversations that followed. People approached me afterward to share their own stories, their struggles with faith, and their hopes for a better world. One man, a prominent scientist, told me, "I've spent my whole life studying the earth, but I've never thought about it the way you described, as a reflection of God's love. You've given me a lot to think about." His words stayed with me, a reminder that even the smallest moments of connection could have a lasting impact. Back home, life settled into a rhythm of speaking engagements, ministry work, and quiet moments of reflection. Daniel and I continued to grow in our faith and in our partnership, supporting each other through the ups and downs of this journey. We found joy in the simple things, morning walks in the woods, evenings spent reading scripture, and the shared gratitude of knowing we were living out our purpose together. One particularly meaningful chapter began when we decided to establish a small retreat center on a piece of land we had inherited from my family. The land, nestled on the edge of a forest and bordered by a winding river, had always been a place of solace for me. Now, we envisioned it as a sanctuary not just for ourselves, but for others seeking renewal and connection with nature, with each other, and with God. The retreat center, which we named Streams of Grace, became a place of transformation for many. We hosted workshops on sustainable living, Bible studies focused on stewardship, and quiet retreats where people could simply rest and reconnect with the Creator. Watching the land come alive with purpose was one of the greatest joys of my life. The trees we planted grew tall, the gardens flourished, and the river, once clouded with sediment, began to run clear again. It was a living testament to the power of restoration, both ecological and spiritual. One of the most profound moments at Streams of Grace came during a retreat for pastors and faith leaders. These were people who had dedicated their lives to ministry but were feeling burned out, overwhelmed by the demands of their work. Over the course of the weekend, we encouraged them to step away from their responsibilities and simply rest in God's presence. On the final night, we gathered by the river for a time of worship, the soft glow of lanterns reflecting off the water. As the group sang hymns, one pastor, a woman named Linda, began to weep. She later shared that she had been carrying the weight of her congregation's struggles for years, feeling as though it was her responsibility to fix everything. But tonight, she said, I felt God reminding me that it's not my burden to carry. He's the healer, not me. I just need to trust Him and love His people. Her words resonated deeply with me, echoing the lesson I had learned during my own journey. Watching her find freedom and surrender was a reminder of how God's grace could reach even the most weary hearts. As the seasons changed, so did the scope of my work. I began to mentor younger leaders, encouraging them to step into their own callings and use their gifts to serve others. Ethan, the young man I had met years ago at one of my talks, became a key part of this effort. His passion for environmental stewardship and his growing faith inspired everyone around him, and I saw in him the same fire that had once burned in me. Together, we worked to equip the next generation of leaders, knowing that the work we had begun would need to continue long after we were gone. In the quiet moments, I often found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The anger and despair that had once consumed me seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a peace that surpassed all understanding. The love of Jesus had transformed every part of my life, turning my pain into purpose and my struggles into strength. And while the world was still filled with challenges, I no longer faced them alone. I had found my place in His story, and that was more than enough. As I sit here now, writing these words, I am overwhelmed by gratitude. Gratitude for the beauty of creation, for the people who have walked this journey with me, and above all, for the Savior who has guided me every step of the way. The stars outside my window shine as brightly as ever, a reminder of His faithfulness and love. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that He holds it, and that is all I need. My life is His, my work is His, and my heart is full of joy for the journey that still lies ahead. As the years wove themselves into decades, the work continued to grow in ways I could never have predicted. Streams of Grace, the retreat center Daniel and I had nurtured, became a beacon for many. People from all walks of life came seeking something: peace, clarity, a sense of purpose, or simply a quiet place to listen to the whisper of God's voice. The land became sacred in its own way, not because of anything we had done, but because of how God met people there. It was humbling to witness transformation after transformation, as hearts were opened, burdens were laid down, and lives were renewed. The retreat center also became a hub for community building. Local farmers, artists, and environmentalists often joined our gatherings, sharing their knowledge and passion with others. We hosted workshops on regenerative farming, reforestation, and even eco-theology, exploring the deep connections between faith and stewardship. One of my favorite traditions that emerged was the annual Creation Sabbath, a day when people from the surrounding area gathered to celebrate the beauty of the natural world through worship, art, and acts of service. Families brought their children, planting trees as a symbol of hope for the future. Musicians played songs inspired by scripture and nature, their melodies echoing through the forest. It was a day of joy, one that reminded us all of the goodness of God's creation and our role in caring for it. But the work wasn't without its struggles. There were seasons of drought, both literal and spiritual, when the land seemed barren and my heart felt heavy. There were moments when I doubted whether the seeds we were planting, both in the soil and in people's hearts, would ever bear fruit. During those times, I returned to prayer, leaning on the truth that had sustained me through every challenge, that God's plans were always greater than my understanding. I found comfort in Scripture, particularly in passages like Isaiah 55 verses 10 to 11, which speaks of God's word going out and not returning empty, but accomplishing the purpose for which it was sent. I clung to that promise, trusting that even when I couldn't see it, He was at work. One particularly challenging season came when a wildfire swept through the area, threatening not only the retreat center but also the surrounding community. The fire was relentless, consuming acres of forest and forcing us to evaluate for weeks. When we were finally allowed to return, the sight was devastating. Much of the forest had been reduced to ash, and parts of the retreat center had been damaged. But even in the midst of the destruction, there were signs of hope. The chapel we had built, a simple wooden structure where so many had encountered God, remained untouched. The cross that stood at its center was still standing, a testament to His faithfulness. Rebuilding was an act of faith. Volunteers from the community and beyond came to help, their hands and hearts eager to restore what had been lost. Together, we replanted trees, repaired buildings, and cleared the land of debris. It was hard, exhausting work, but it was also deeply meaningful. The fire had taken much, but it couldn't take away the spirit of hope and resilience that God had placed within us. And as the first green shoots began to push through the blackened soil, I was reminded once again of His promise to bring beauty from ashes. As the retreat center was rebuilt, my focus also began to shift. I found myself drawn more and more to mentoring and teaching, pouring into others so they could carry the work forward. Ethan, now a confident and compassionate leader, became a partner in this effort. Together, we developed programs to equip young people with the tools they needed to live out their faith in practical ways. We taught them not only about environmental stewardship but also about the importance of humility, perseverance, and reliance on God. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was watching the ripple effects. The young people we mentored went on to start their own initiatives, community gardens, conservation projects, and faith-based organizations that combined environmental care with spiritual growth. They carried the message of love and stewardship into places I could never reach, and I marveled at how God was multiplying the work far beyond what I had imagined. As I grew older, I began to step back from some of the more demanding aspects of the work, trusting others to take the lead. Daniel and I spent more time simply enjoying the beauty around us, walking through the now thriving forest, sitting by the river, and reflecting on the journey we had walked together. We often talked about how much had changed since the early days when I had been consumed by anger and despair. Do you ever think about what life would have been like if you hadn't had that experience? Daniel asked me one evening as we sat by the fire. I thought about it for a moment, about the path I had been on before my near-death experience and how different it had been from the one I eventually took. Sometimes, I admitted. But I think I would have burned out. I was trying to carry a weight that wasn't mine to carry. Without Jesus, without His love and grace, I don't think I could have kept going. He didn't just save my life, He gave me a new one. Daniel nodded, his face thoughtful. It's amazing to see how He's used your story to touch so many lives. I think about all the people who've come through streams of grace, all the young leaders you've mentored. None of that would have happened if you hadn't said yes to Him. His word stayed with me, a reminder of how much God could do with even the smallest acts of obedience. It wasn't about my strength, my plans, or my abilities. It was about His power working through me, turning my weaknesses into opportunities for His glory. In the final chapters of my life, I found myself reflecting more and more on the legacy I would leave behind. Not in terms of achievements or recognition, but in terms of the seeds that had been planted. I thought about the trees that now stood tall where there had once been barren ground. I thought about the people whose lives had been touched by the message of God's love, and about the next generation of leaders who were carrying that message forward. And I thought about the countless moments of grace, both seen and unseen, that had shaped this journey. One evening, as I sat by the river with Daniel, I felt a deep sense of peace. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I said, my voice soft. "It is," Daniel agreed, taking my hand. "And so is the life we've been given." In that moment, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, I could face it with confidence. My life, like the retreat center, like the forest, like the river, had been shaped by his hands. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey, for the work, and for the love that had carried me through it all. As the years unfolded further, the rhythm of life slowed, but its meaning deepened. I found myself embracing the quiet moments more often, pauses in the symphony of life where I could simply sit with God and marvel at his handiwork. The forest surrounding Streams of Grace had grown into a lush sanctuary, its trees tall and strong, a testament to resilience and renewal. Each time I walked beneath their canopy, I couldn't help but remember the early days after the fire, when the land seemed hopelessly scarred. Yet here it was, alive again, vibrant and whole, a living parable of restoration. Daniel and I often spent our mornings together in the garden, him tending to the flowers, me journaling or sitting quietly with a cup of tea. Our conversations had shifted over the years, becoming less about plans and ambitions and more about gratitude. "God has been good to us," Daniel would often say, his hands brushing the earth as he planted new seeds. And I would nod, my heart full, knowing that every step of this journey had been marked by his faithfulness. One day, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, a letter arrived. It was from Ethan, who had become not only a dear friend, but also a leader in his own right. His work had taken him to places I could only dream of, remote villages, bustling cities, and even international conferences where he spoke about the intersection of faith, justice, and environmental care. In his letter, Ethan wrote about a new initiative he was launching, one inspired by the principles he had learned during his time at Streams of Grace. He called it Rooted in Hope, a global network of faith-based environmental leaders who would work together to care for creation and share the love of Christ. "I couldn't have done this without you," Ethan wrote. "Thank you for believing in me, for showing me what it means to live out faith with courage and compassion. I'm carrying this forward because I know it's what God has called me to do, and I hope to make you proud." I held the letter in my hands for a long time, tears welling in my eyes. It wasn't pride that filled me, but something far deeper, a sense of awe at how God could take the smallest acts of obedience and multiply them in ways I could never have imagined. Ethan's words were a reminder that the seeds we plant in faith often grow far beyond our sight, touching lives and shaping futures in ways we may never fully understand. The letter also reminded me of my own mentors, the people who had shaped me along the way. Some of them were still with me, their wisdom and encouragement continuing to guide me. Others had passed on, leaving behind legacies of love and faith that I carried with me. I thought about how their lives had intersected with mine, how their words and actions had planted seeds in my heart that were now bearing fruit. It was a humbling realization, one that deepened my commitment to pouring into others for as long as I could. As the years turned into a gentle twilight, I began to think more about the stories I wanted to leave behind. With Daniel's encouragement, I started writing a memoir, not for fame or recognition, but as a way to share the lessons I had learned with those who might come after me. The process was both challenging and rewarding, forcing me to reflect on the journey in its entirety, the struggles, the breakthroughs, the moments of doubt, and the countless instances of God's grace. I wrote about my near-death experience, about the vision of Jesus that had changed everything, and about how that encounter had shaped every decision I had made since. I wrote about Streams of Grace, about the people who had walked its paths and the transformations I had witnessed there. And I wrote about the hope that had sustained me through it all, a hope rooted not in human effort, but in the unshakable love of Christ. The memoir, titled Restoration, A Journey of Faith, Stewardship, and Hope, was published quietly, with little fanfare. I didn't expect it to reach a wide audience, but God had other plans. To my surprise, the book found its way into the hands of people around the world, activists, pastors, teachers, and even those who had never considered matters of faith before. Letters began to arrive from readers who shared how the book had touched their lives. One young woman wrote about how it had reignited her faith after years of feeling disconnected from God. A pastor told me it had inspired him to start a creation care ministry in his church. A scientist shared how it had helped him see his work in a new light, as an act of worship rather than mere research. Each letter was a reminder of the ripple effects of obedience, of how God could use even the smallest offerings to accomplish His purposes. It wasn't about me or my story, it was about Him, about His love reaching into places and lives I could never have imagined. And as I read each letter, I whispered a prayer of thanks for the privilege of being part of His work. Eventually, Daniel and I began to slow down even more, entrusting the day-to-day operations of Streams of Grace to a younger couple who shared our vision and heart. They had been part of our community for years, and we knew the retreat center would be in good hands. Stepping back was bittersweet, but it also felt right. We had poured our hearts into this place, and now it was time to let others carry it forward. In our quiet days, I often found myself sitting by the river, watching its waters flow steadily toward the horizon. The river had always been a source of peace for me, a reminder of the constancy of God's love. No matter what storms came, no matter how the landscape changed, the river kept flowing, carving its path with quiet persistence. It was a lesson I carried with me, a reminder that life, like the river, was part of a greater story, one that unfolded according to His perfect plan. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of gold and pink, I sat by the river with Daniel at my side. The air was filled with the sounds of nature, birds singing, leaves rustling, water gently lapping at the shore. I closed my eyes and let the peace of the moment wash over me, feeling the presence of God as strongly as I had on the day He first called me. "It's been a good journey," I said softly, turning to Daniel. "It has," he agreed, his hand resting gently on mine. "And it's not over yet." I smiled, knowing he was right. The journey wasn't over, not for us, and not for the seeds we had planted along the way. They would continue to grow, watered by His grace and nurtured by His love. And as I looked out at the river, its surface shimmering in the fading light, I felt a profound sense of peace. My life, like the waters before me, was part of something far greater than I could ever comprehend. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. The final chapter of my story unfolded slowly, like the gentle turning of seasons. Life became simpler, quieter, and yet richer in ways that words could never fully capture. Daniel and I spent most of our days at home, surrounded by the forest that had grown tall and strong over the years. Streams of Grace was now in the capable hands of the younger couple we had entrusted it to, and they often visited us with updates about how the center was thriving. It brought me joy to hear their stories, of new programs, of lives being touched, of the seeds we had planted continuing to bear fruit. Physically, I began to feel the weight of age. My energy waned, and some days my body ached in ways it never had before. But my spirit felt lighter than ever. The years had taught me to let go of the burdens I once tried to carry and to trust fully in the One who held it all. The peace I had found in Him only deepened as time went on, and I began to see even the smallest moments, like the sunlight filtering through the trees or the sound of Daniel humming an old hymn, as gifts of grace. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves blazed gold and crimson, Ethan came to visit. He was no longer the young man I had met all those years ago, burdened by despair and uncertainty. He had grown into a leader whose wisdom and compassion inspired everyone around him. As we sat together on the porch, sipping tea and watching the leaves drift to the ground, he shared updates about Rooted in Hope, the initiative he had founded. "It's expanding faster than I ever imagined," he said, his voice filled with both excitement and humility. "We're working in over 20 countries now, partnering with churches, schools, and communities to care for creation and share the love of Christ. But none of this would have happened without you." I shook my head, a soft smile on my face. "It's not me, Ethan. It's Him. I was just one small part of what He's doing through you and so many others. And seeing how far you've come, it's one of the greatest joys of my life." Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. "You've been a spiritual mother to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I just want you to know how much that means." His words touched me deeply, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. When I finally found my voice, I said, "The greatest legacy we can leave isn't in the work we do, but in the lives we touch. And you, Ethan, you're carrying that legacy forward in ways I could never have dreamed." That evening, after Ethan left, I sat with Daniel by the fire, reflecting on the journey we had walked together. "Do you think we've done enough?" I asked him, my voice quiet. Daniel looked at me, his eyes filled with the steady love that had carried us through so many seasons. "We've done what he called us to do," he said. "And that's enough." As the fire crackled and the stars began to appear in the night sky, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I didn't need to know how every thread of my story would weave into the larger tapestry. I trusted that God was the master weaver, and that every moment, every act of faith, every seed planted, every prayer whispered, had its place in His perfect design. In the months that followed, my health began to decline more noticeably. There were days when I was too weak to leave the house, but even then, I felt surrounded by God's presence. Friends and family visited often, filling our home with laughter, prayer, and love. Ethan came by regularly, sometimes bringing letters from people who had read my memoir or been impacted by the work at Streams of Grace. Their words were a balm to my soul, reminders of how far God's reach extended. One evening, as winter approached and the first frost glistened on the ground, I felt a quiet stirring in my heart, a sense that my time on this earth was drawing to a close. I wasn't afraid. In fact, I felt a profound sense of readiness. I had lived a life full of purpose, love, and faith, and I knew that the journey ahead would lead me into the arms of the one who had walked with me every step of the way. That night, as Daniel sat by my bedside, I took his hand in mine. "I'm so grateful for you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For everything we've shared, for the life we've built together." Tears welled in his eyes as he leaned closer. "You've been my greatest blessing," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll carry you with me, always." We prayed together one last time, thanking God for His faithfulness and for the love that had carried us through every trial and triumph. And as I drifted into sleep, I felt a warmth unlike anything I had ever known, a light that wrapped around me, filling me with peace and joy. It was the same light I had glimpsed all those years ago, during my near-death experience, when Jesus had shown me the depths of His love. But this time, I wasn't being sent back. I was going home. When I opened my eyes again, it wasn't to the walls of our little house or the familiar faces of loved ones. It was to a place of indescribable beauty, a place where every leaf, every blade of grass, every star in the sky seemed to sing with the glory of its Creator. And there He was, standing before me, His eyes filled with a love so overwhelming that it brought me to my knees. "Welcome home," He said, His voice gentle and full of joy. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for everything." And in that moment, I knew that every step of the journey, all the struggles, the doubts, the moments of grace, had led me to this. To Him. To eternity. Back on earth, Daniel and those who loved me mourned my passing, but they also celebrated the life I had lived. Streams of Grace continued to thrive, its mission carried forward by the next generation. Ethan and others like him kept planting seeds of hope and faith, their work a continuation of the story God had begun in me. And as they walked their own journeys, I knew they would feel the same love, the same grace, the same guiding hand that had carried me through mine. Because the story wasn't just mine, it was His, always His. And it would go on, weaving its way through countless lives, until the day when all things would be made new.